Welcome to the MSDW podcast. I'm Jason Gumpert, editor at msdynamicsworld.com. Today we're talking about selling your technology services business, what it's worth today, how to boost its value, what these deals look like, and what the sale experience might be like for an owner looking for an exit in the immediate future or the more distant future. Our guest is Linda Rose, a veteran of the tech services space and the Microsoft channel in particular. She sold 3 businesses over her career, most recently her cloud services business about 2 years ago. And after taking some time off for a few adventures, she is back to work with a new book for other business owners. It's called Get Acquired for Millions, a roadmap for technology service providers to maximize company value. We talk about her own experiences as an entrepreneur and sale of her businesses, her research, and some of the findings and recommendations in her book. All right, we are on. And hey, Linda Rose, thanks for coming back to the podcast. It's great to have you here.
Jason, thank you. It's been a while, so thank you for having me back.
It has, and we're here for a great reason right now. It's pretty exciting time for you with your new book coming out in the near future.
Yes, yes. Gonna
Um,
do a launch at Inspires, so pretty excited about that.
yeah. So, well, maybe to start, we could just talk a little bit about what what has happened to you. So you've gone from a technology service provider to well, I guess a former one because you sold your
Mm-hmm.
most recent business. You took some time off. You talk about that in the book, but now you're really entering, I would say, a new phase of your professional life with the book and the work you're doing that is kind of reflected in the book. Can you talk a little bit about that transition that you made?
Yes, so it's been a little over 2 years since I walked out the door of Rose ASP, and I definitely needed a little time off after that. You and I have talked since then. I went from there, and I think basically 45 days later, picked up a backpack and started hiking 500 miles of the Pacific Crest Trail. But and during that time, I was really contemplating what I was going to do next because when I sold the company, I really didn't know what that was going to be. And I did know that I just really wasn't quite ready to retire yet, but I just didn't know how I was going to reincarnate myself yet another time. And so, interestingly enough, right before I got started on the trail, I read this article from a forester analyst. His name is Jay McBain. And again, this was in 2017. And he wrote an article. And in the article, he quoted that, based on his research, that 40% of the channel, partner channel, will age out or basically retire by 2024. And when I read that article, I'm like, wow, that is so true. And I then also realized that majority of these people that are going to sell in now the next 5 years have never been through this process before, and I could probably share with them a few things. And so I kind of mulled over that while I was hiking on the trail, and I know specifically the timing of that because my hiking partner that I met accidentally on the trail was also a technology guy, and he was from the Czech Republic. And I, for 400 miles, chatted on and off with him. I'm like, so do you think this is a good idea? Do you think people would read this book? He was sort of like my sounding board. And he's like, no, you should definitely write this book. And so when I got off the trail, I kind of had a new mission in life. And that's basically what I've been doing for the last year and a half is spending time writing and interviewing partners that have bought companies and sold companies, both from strategic partners to private equity groups. And then also, I've sold 3 companies now over my career and have made many mistakes each time. Even on this last deal, I made mistakes. And I really wanted to wrap all that up and a little bit of a pay forward, I guess, too, if you want to call it, Jason, is just to really give back to this community that has supported me over the last 25 years, specifically over the last 16, because Rose ASP sold through a partner channel. I mean, 80% of our sales was through the partner channel. So I just really wanted to support the people who supported me. And I thought this would be a great way to give back what I learned.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Really, the timing couldn't be better. I think, just given, like you said, I mean, anecdotally, you can go to a technology conference and you can see that in these partner-driven in a partner-driven channel, owners do seem to be, getting older, and many of them are 20, 25-year veterans in that sort of leadership role. So I certainly understand what you're talking about there. Um, the other thing I thought was interesting was to write this kind of, given the situation that you came out of it, where it's still relatively fresh. You had just dealt with a lot of the particulars, which you really dive into in the book. A lot of particular sort of, um, financial kind of requirements and strategic sort of ideas in how to approach selling a business that is in the technology services space. Um, did coming just out recently out of a deal sort of help you sort of generate the book and put it together, or did it really feel like starting fresh?
It was a little bit of both, Jason.
Mm,
I mean, obviously, I learned a lot coming out of the deal. And I'm the kind of person I sort of self-analyze and go, okay, what could I have done better there? Or, did I leave some money on the table? I mean, that's really every partner's concern, is selling to the right person so that culturally their people, whether they stay or whether they exit, that it's a good cultural fit. That's first and foremost, I think, on most partners' minds, is, making sure that it's a good cultural fit. And secondly, did they sell their company for the value that it's worth, right? And so one of the things, so I've always been a numbers person. I think we've talked about this before. My background, I was an accountant and a CPA in a former life, and then just having been a CEO of multiple companies over my life, just learned a lot. My the first sale I did was actually to a partner, my actual business partner. I had a staffing firm that I had for 9 years. I sold to a business partner, so that had some unique challenges. The second company, which was Rose Business Solutions, I sold to a large CPA firm. I learned some things there, and then this last one was to a private equity. So I kind of hit all of the different types of players, so to speak, and each one of them was very, very different. They were approached very differently, and I learned a lot. But then also, being a numbers person, I really felt like I had to put examples around a lot of this, and which then led me to the assessments, where I'm like, okay, well, people need to know what their company is worth today, right? It's just like a house, right? If you own a piece of property, a home, you always know what your house is worth, right? If you don't get the actual emails from Zillow that says, "Oh, your property went up 2% this month," or
right.
this year, right? You always know what your house is worth. And if you're contemplating, like, let's say, a kitchen remodel or a master bathroom remodel, there are sites that will tell you, what it costs and how that will increase the value of your home. Well, really, there's nothing out there specifically for partners. Well, actually, there's really nothing out there in general, but specifically for technology service partners, there's nothing out there that really tells them what the value of their company is by partner type, because it does change by partner type. So you can't value an ISV the same way you would value a VAR. They change, their multiples are different, as well as based upon what your revenue is, the multiples change as well. So I really wanted to put some numbers and some data and some value behind all this, which is what made me decide to create the assessment as well, so that people could actually see what their numbers would be today if they went through that process, and what they could work on, and how much that means from a qualitative and quantitative value if they actually worked on increasing IP, or if they actually worked on increasing reoccurring revenue. So it was, so going back to answer your question, it was a combination of taking what I learned and then learning some more, and then creating this and wrapping it all into this one resource, which has a ton of different resources that you can use within the book as well.
One of the questions that I came away with was um, maybe a bit of a philosophical one. The idea that it makes total sense what you were describing of, kind of assessing where your business is at, where you might want to get it to, by changing certain characteristics of the business's financial performance and operational elements to really kind of maximize the value of the business if it's going to be valued by a buyer. And it also occurred to me that well, I'd like to know from you, is that some of those changes, are those just good changes to make for most businesses anyways? So if you're and I think of the example of if you're a,
Y-
a reseller in the software space and you're still mostly based on sort of an older model that's not monthly recurring revenue, should you just for the health of your business, be trying to make that transition regardless?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. Right. And so, what I tell people is, and I'm not here to sell books necessarily because that's not what this interview is about, but I tell people you need to create a company that you can sell for the most one day down the road, because we all know at some point we need to divest ourselves and do something else, whether you start another company, whether you retire, whether you do some charitable work, whatever the case may be. But along the way, do the right things to create the most value for your company, right? So I encourage people to pick up this book not when they're ready to sell, but years and years in advance, because the 8 value maximizer, the 8 value drivers that we talk about in the book, those are things that you should do generally to increase your bottom line, like obviously increase your recurring revenue, create some IP, things like that. But it also are things that have been identified by buyers that they are looking for these things when they're assessing the value of a company. And I think we should all be working on it, and they align completely with some of the things that Microsoft talks about as well, right? So, finding a vertical. But, then I also see partners that are like 5 million in revenue that have 5 verticals. And I'm like, no, you can't do that. You can't, that's too many verticals, right? So I talk about, a lot of the things that we are used to hearing, recurring revenue, IP, verticals, but I talk about them in a different way. I talk about them in the way more that buyers look at them,
Hmm.
because they assess it in a different way, right? And so I think that's where some of the value comes in is, yeah, these are all the things that Microsoft tells partners to do, but I'm not giving it a different spin, I guess, if you want to.
Yeah, and you identify, quite a few very specific ones. Vertical having a vertical focus is one area, but I, I noted a couple that I thought were kind of very specific. For example, looking at high employee retention is just one of the. It's not the factor, but it's one of the factors, right? That buyers, potential prospective buyers, will want to see data on, right? Among others.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then that high customer retention rate and customer sat rate as well. I mean, not enough of us, a lot of partners, because they're gold or silver, well, most likely it's just gold partners now that have to do CSAT, but we should all be doing customer sats, and we should be rewarding our employees for high customer sat, and we should be posting our customer sat results on our websites and promoting that. And we had a really high customer retention rate, and that was so critical for our numbers as well. And the buyer was just, they loved the fact that we had such a high retention rate, because they could guarantee then their own revenue going forward, and that's so important for buyers, is
Yeah,
that they know that they can keep the customers once you leave.
yeah, it certainly makes sense that it might be the kind of thing that a lot of businesses they know it's important, but maybe um, they aren't tracking it as closely as they would need to, and better to start now than to try to catch up on it, right? Um, yeah. Another area that that caught my attention was because you talk in the book about you use a sort of a representative, sort of not real person, Robert, eh,
Robert, yes.
who we get to know very well, and goes through some very realistic conversations, and very realistic kind of probably um, parts of the sale process or acquisition process. And um, one of the things that comes through is the psychological factors uh, that you, I think, in the book are trying to prepare people for. You discuss some very real stresses. Can you talk about some of those that you think are really common or that people should be prepared for?
Yes. So Robert, uh, I had so many great conversations with partners, and invariably all of them said, now, this is off the record, right? You can't write that in your book, right? You know that, right? I'm like, okay, I get it. So, and I of course had some of my own experiences as well, and due to NDAs and things like that, I couldn't expose that either, right? So Robert became that amalgamation of all the partners that I talked to that shared just countless stories with me, and this is what I would have done differently, and this is what I felt at this time. And so, he pops up throughout the book and shares some, what he's going through personally at that moment, right? But he's obviously a fictional character, and the book actually starts out with a great opening scene of Robert signing on the bottom line, and he's basically selling his company that he's had for 17 years, and tomorrow he's not going to be the CEO anymore. And you know, there's a lot of emotions that come with that, and there's a lot of stresses that go with selling your company. And if you don't do it right, it can be more stressful than it needs to be. And actually, before I talk about that, one of the things that I put in this book was a second assessment, which is called the pre-score assessment, which actually is not a numbers assessment, Jason, but it's an assessment to determine if you mentally are ready to exit. Because I find that some people, their numbers are just in a perfect spot, but they don't pull the trigger because they just don't see what they're going to do in their next life, right? And how they're going to make that transition. So there's a second assessment in the book that allows people to sort of figure that out. But yeah, absolutely, it's usually a year-long process, and if you haven't prepared yourself in advance and gotten a few things done and under your belt in advance, that year can be incredibly stressful. And for me, it was on this last deal, it was incredibly stressful because I wasn't prepared in advance by my broker to get all the due diligence uploaded to a virtual data room in advance. That was one of the big, I would say lessons I learned, that I am now like telling people, look, if you're going to go through this process, start preparing that stuff, get that data room together in advance, because once an LOI is signed, a letter of intent, people are doing due diligence and negotiating contracts at the same time. That's a lot of stress. And then probably not telling your people either. And we talk about it in the book, is, when's the appropriate time to tell your organization, your team, your managers, because that can be very stressful for some CEOs. I've had lots of conversations with people about when is the right time to really disclose that. And you don't want to do it too soon either. There's just a right time for everything.
Yeah, I mean, you even I think mentioned one point where it sounded like you neared at least momentarily, a breaking point, and maybe frustration got the better part of you in one of the companies that you've sold, right?
Yes. I mean, yeah, you always also want to be in a position where you don't have to sell. And I totally remember being across the table. No, I'm sorry, Robert was across the table and talking to the buyer, and saying, well, the buyer would say, Robert would say, hey, I don't need to sell my company, and the buyer would say, well, I don't need to buy your company. And you're sitting there at an impasse, and then you continue on, with the negotiation, because both sides of the table know that the deal doesn't have to be done. And you always want to be in that position as a seller. You always want to be in that position where maybe it's not your only buyer and you have other opportunities and you don't need to sell today. So part of that lesson is not waiting until you absolutely have to do it.
Another thing I wonder about in the technology services space, especially because you do see so many owner operators who have had their hands on things. They're real problem solvers. They're very involved in figuring things out, and all of a sudden they're in this kind of area where they're not experts anymore. To add to that, as you describe, especially if it's private equity or if it's a bigger technology firm, they're negotiating with a team of sort of acquisition experts who, like you said, there's a letter of intent, and then there's a very intense due diligence and negotiation process that doesn't just wait, right? It doesn't.
Right.
You
No, it
can't just you
doesn't.
can't put it off at that point. You're really in it. So I just wonder about well, maybe this gets into whether or not to use a broker as well, but also sort of how to manage those challenges of dealing with this sort of uncharted water you're in. If you haven't gone through it before, can you talk a little bit more about both sides of that? How can are there risks to trying to do too much yourself if you're a business owner? And B, um, why brokers come into the book so much, and
Yeah,
why that's an element to consider.
sure. So, not calling myself a broker, I kind of call myself more of an M&A coach. I truly believe you can sell your company on your own, and that's going against what every broker would say. It's not easy. You have to have a really strong management team if you're going to go down that route, because there's a lot of work in prepping and marketing your company to buyers. Now, the reason people did this, and that's called running a process, right? So if you want multiple buyers to come to the table, you're going to what's called run a process. And brokers are really, really good at this. And why most people have chosen to go out and use brokers, and why I chose to go out and use brokers, is you don't know who the buyers are outside of the people you know, right? And so before I, thought about selling Rose ASP, I kind of looked around and said, okay, well, who in this ecosystem do I want to sell to? And there really wasn't anybody there that I thought could really, I don't know, move the needle for me in terms of giving me the value of what I was looking for and just provide some additional capital to help this company grow. So I knew that I wanted to go out and look at private equity. And typically, partners don't know who the private equity firms are. And there are sites now today. I mean, just like you don't need a broker to sell your home. You don't need a broker truly to sell your business. Although I would say I recommend that you have somebody at a minimum, a coach to help you through that process, because in the end, you don't really want to be the person negotiating with the person across the table, right? Because just like on a lease, if you put it in those terms, you don't want to be negotiating with your landlord, right? Because as you're going through the deal negotiation, stuff can get ugly, words can get said that can't be unsaid, that kind of stuff, and then people kind of leave that potentially with a bad taste in their mouth. If you get a broker in the middle, or an intermediary, or a coach, then you're not the one saying those words. Your coach or your broker is, and so you can play good cop, bad cop a little bit in that regard. And so once the sale actually happens, then everybody's still happy, and you move on. So you know I think the majority of deals in the channel, because they're done between one partner and another, and one partner approaches another, I think majority of them are actually done without an intermediary or a coach. But I think in many circumstances you would do better if you had one. So it depends on the company. It depends on the level of sophistication. If you've been through this before and you know how to run a process, then I could say absolutely, with the tools that are available in the marketplace, you could run it yourself. It's a huge undertaking. But I think for most companies, they need some help. And that whether that help is a coach or a business
Hmm.
broker, if they want to run a process where they get multiple buyers to the table, you're probably going to use a MA advisor, or a broker for that process.
And how do you define the difference between a coach and a broker?
A coach typically is a person that gets compensated if the deal gets done, but maybe not on a sliding scale. So they may be the person that doesn't necessarily bring the buyer to the table to you, but you maybe have some buyers that you're interested in, and they'll go and approach those buyers for you. And so, I mean, they kind of do the same thing in a way, but they just work a little differently. They're not motivated to find the best deal for you in terms of a price, because, for example, you could get a two offers. One is 5x revenue or 5x EBITDA, the other one's 6x EBITDA. And obviously, the broker is going to get compensated more on the 6x EBITDA. But the 5x EBITDA at the end of the day might be a better deal for you, because A, it might be majority of cash, and less on an earnout, or there's a note instead. And so the probability of achieving it is much higher than potentially getting 50% cash and 50% earnout, where that number might be higher. That entire earnout might not be achievable, but you're still going to have to pay your broker on the earnout whether you achieve it or not. So there's slightly different motivations there, and you just have to figure out what makes sense for you and what works best for you.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we could touch on just a couple of the other tips that I ran across, or points that you made that I thought were interesting. Without without sort of revealing the knowledge and wisdom that's in the book. But uh, one of them was kind of the importance of a letter of intent. And you even write about how some sellers aren't really familiar with what it means to have a letter of intent,
Hmm.
and the leverage that a seller has before as opposed to after one is signed. Um,
Yes, that's very good point. So the funnest part in the process, I think, is the marketing before and finding the buyers and having conversations with everybody, talking about your company and your achievements and all that. And typically if you use a broker, you're going to have a dozen of those conversations, right? You may have more than that that's interested in you, but in terms of the people that are really qualified, like we had quite a few people that were interested in us. And I think at the end of the day, maybe we had 15, max 20 conversations, because we whittled out some people who I didn't think would be a good fit if they purchase our organization. So those are really fun. But once you lock down into an LOI, and typically in the LOI they're going to give you the terms of the agreement. They're going to talk a little bit about your non-compete. They're going to let you know if it's an asset or a stock sale. Once you sign up a letter of intent, you're locked down typically for 60 or 90 days, meaning you can't negotiate with anybody anymore on anything else, right? It's just you're locked down with this particular potential buyer. And so you have to be sure that A, these are the guys that you want to pick, and B, they have the money to buy you, right? So kind of two very key things, because you don't want to get to the end and find out that the buyer actually didn't have the funds in hand and couldn't make the transaction happen. Now you've just wasted 2-3 months with these people while you had some potential other buyers on the hook, and now they are not interested anymore. They've gone on to other acquisitions, right? So really making that decision as to who you're going to sign that letter of intent with is really important. But then as soon as you do, the tables really turn, in the sense that you were sort of had the upper hand because you could pick between who your suitors were and then just pick one. Now that you've made the choice, they are now looking at you going, okay, let's find every single flaw or every single possible way we can beat down this number, right? So, you went from having a lot of fun, having lots of conversations, to feeling like you've just been through the worst audit of your life, right? Because now you have to defend every single one of your numbers and how you got there and why you got there, and it's a little bit of an inquisition, right? So the tables turn really, really quickly, and obviously you want to keep the value up of what was in the LOI. That's
right.
obviously your goal.
Well, if I could shift gears just a minute, and one of the things I was also thinking about in reading this was related to the Microsoft partner channel in particular, and Dynamics partner focused partners as well. There's a lot of our who happen to are a lot of our readers. Are there particular sort of types of deals in that particular space um, that you are kind of watching with most interest these days, kind of given where Microsoft's priorities have gone and how the products have changed, those types of factors?
Yes, and it's interesting too. So we have a new buyer in the space now. When I say in this space, because most Dynamics partners are typically under 10 million. I mean, there's quite a few in our space that are over that, and of course there's some that are much, much larger than that, but the majority of partners are under the 10, 25 million in revenue. And typically the only buyers in this space were other partners or strategic buyers, right? But now we see this new buyer, which is our private equity firms. And typically, private equity firms didn't want to get involved with a company that was less than 50 million in revenue, 5 million in EBITDA, that kind of stuff. Now you see private equity firms looking at companies that are $5 million in revenue, $1 million in EBITDA. And so they are, bringing a whole new spin on this, right? And as I mentioned earlier, when I went out and did the 8 value drivers, based upon whether you're a private equity firm or a strategic firm, you look at those 8 drivers differently. So, for example, for private equity firms, their key focus is on customer retention, management team, recurring revenue. they actually don't care as much about sales and marketing and IP. I say that very lightly, okay? Because especially in this channel, because a lot of private equity firms are very suspect of IP written in the Microsoft space because they're all very concerned that Microsoft just might create it themselves and then that IP that they just bought just vanishes, right? So, it's only very unique, very it's just a certain kind of IP that really, really piques their interest. They're more suspect than they are not. Whereas strategic partners, they're very interested in IP, very interested in verticals, obviously also interested in customer retention and growth rate. So the two different groups, buying groups, look at different things, right? And so, yes, we're all been taught to verticalize, increase our recurring revenue. The other thing that I'm starting to see now is a lot of the private equity firms have made their first acquisition in this space and they've learned a lot. And what I'm seeing on the second round of acquisitions is, you know what? We really don't want as much consulting revenue. We're looking more for product sales and package solutions and software as a service kind of thing. They are looking less and less at the consulting revenue. They want to see less consulting revenue and more product sales. That's what I'm seeing on this sort of second round. So they're sort of learning from their first round of acquisitions and going, okay, this worked for us and this is what we're struggling with. And because again, if you think about it, Jason, consulting revenue is always, especially if you're billing by the hour, is always around people and bodies and whether they're showing up for work that day or not, right? Because
Right.
if the body is not there, it's not billing, right?
Right. Right.
But on packaged revenue, on packaged offerings, which I'm encouraging every partner to take what was a service, even if it was 100% billable hours, turn it into a package that can be sold up front and delivered over time. That's what especially the private equity firms are looking for now in their second round of acquisitions that they're making.
Hmm. Um, Very interesting. I'm just thinking, as you were saying that, I was thinking back because I've taken a couple of calls myself in the last year and a half from private equity firms or people researching on behalf of them, trying to understand the Microsoft Partner Channel. And it's funny because from my perspective, it seemed like what they were most trying to understand was the health of Microsoft's products in the context of, for companies they were looking at, sort of how healthy was the technology underneath which these companies were selling their products or services. And it seemed like they wanted to make sure that these companies were in a channel that they could trust to some extent as well. And I'd be interested to looking back whether that was sort of first wave buying or perhaps like you're talking about here, second wave.
Yeah, I think it was first wave buying because what I see now is a lot of people who haven't been looking at Microsoft or this channel now looking at it because if you think about it,
Mm-hmm.
Jason, there are so many different things you could sell, right? And there's so many ways you can marry up different organizations. So, for example, why not buy an ERP firm and marry it up with a CRM firm and marry it up with an O365 firm and marry it up with a BI firm, right? And you have
Mm-hmm.
one, and it's all Microsoft products, right? I mean, what other vendor can is so diverse, right? There's few, right? So being able to do that and get the economies of scale and the upsell cross sell between just even O365 and ERP, for example, right?
Right. Yep.
I do see some vendors that are kind of now going, you know what? We want Salesforce and CRM or customer engagement. I should call it CRM anymore. And so I see a little bit of that where they're going cross platforms, but I see a lot of private equity firms now going, you know what? We're all in Microsoft. We're good. There's so much here to sell because most of them like to buy that primary company and then tuck other companies in around them and come up with something much larger. And the benefit of that is they get the economies of scale within the organization. They can have people teach other things, and then it's the whole cross sell, upsell in the existing customer bases of all these companies that they just bought.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, you can't do that with Salesforce. You can't do that with Sage. You can't do that with Citrix. Uh, you can do that with SAP to the extent that you can marry up, you know, well, sorry, Salesforce. You can do that to the extent that you can marry up Salesforce and Financial Force, ERP and CRM there. But there's not a whole lot of channels that are so diverse that you could pull together so many different types of organizations and come up with just a great company and sell that for so many more multiples down the road. And people are starting to understand that, and that's why they're so interested in this space.
Interesting. Do you think a lot of when I just sort of watch press releases and I hear from different companies, and you do see a mix. So you definitely see family offices and private equity firms like you were talking about clearly making acquisitions, um, you know, right on through this week and beyond, and it'll continue.
Yeah.
But you also see the strategic acquisitions. I always
Hmm.
feel like sometimes those strategic acquisitions seem like they're positioning themselves then for perhaps a private equity type of an acquisition of their own, building the value of their own companies just for that same reason.
That's exactly what they're doing.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Just want to
we,
make sure I wasn't
yeah,
losing.
yeah, we're clear on that.
Yeah. Yeah, probably no surprise to anyone there.
And you're seeing that in the MSP space as well,
Okay.
because because there the margins are less. So this same Forrester analyst came out with another quote not that long ago that said that 70% of MSPs are looking to sell in the next 3 years. That's a
Wow.
staggering amount of
Yeah.
people. And I'm like, why? Well, because the margins have gotten down to like 17%. And so you kind of need that economies of scale. You need to be over $25 million in revenue to make it worthwhile. And so you see a lot of consolidation happening in that industry. And actually, the majority of MSPs are actually smaller than Dynamics partners. They're
Oh,
way below
interesting.
the 5 million in revenue, like more in the 2-3 million in revenue. And so they need to consolidate more, get that accretive value, so that they can become something part of something larger.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Um, so just a couple more points. I mean, one of them is, some of these value maximization figures we've been talking about will be part of the release of this podcast episode is that we will be providing our readers for a limited time with a special code on that. I just want to note that before I forget here. And with the launch of the book coming up this in the next weeks, the pre-release and then the real ship date in August. I think we want to make sure people are aware of that. We'll post a link to that as well. I did want to also talk about one of the most interesting chapters in the book. I think, which is maybe the very last one. But you're
Mm-hmm.
looking at uh, women who own tech service provider type of businesses, going from partly or maybe mostly from. You share a lot of your own personal experience building businesses and some perspective on why you think the rates of women owners in these types of businesses remains pretty low. Um, so yeah, maybe you could tell a little bit about um, what you see in your approach that maybe hasn't been replicated so often. What um, some of the barriers have been, or what you'd like to see change.
Yeah, so that is the last chapter of the book. It's called The Female Factor. And I got to say, Jason, that was the most difficult chapter for me to write. It was, I think I rewrote it like 4 or 5 times. Part of it was because I was drawing from my own experiences, and I started, 25 years ago, and a lot has changed positively for women. And I didn't want to, although I wanted to share some of those experiences, I didn't want to assume that women are still dealing with them today, but yet in some respects they are. So, I talk about in one of the FAQs, I kind of break it down into like kind of the 10 common questions I get asked as a female tech entrepreneur. And and the struggles that I've had. And I got to say, in the early days I didn't experience it so much towards the end, partially because I wasn't really outselling as much and being that frontline person. Most of my customers didn't really know who I was, but back in the early days, for sure, I had to deal with sexual harassment and unwanted advancements from men. And I got to tell you, Jason, that's tough to deal with if it's one of your biggest customers, right? I mean, you just can't go, oh, excuse me, let's just quit the deal today, right? I mean, when in the early days, you've got just a handful of customers that are your largest customers, and they're providing the food on the table for your employees and are helping you make payroll every two weeks. So you have to handle those things quite delicately. And it was, obviously prior to the Me Too movement and all that, but I think there's obviously so much more visibility around that I don't think women are seeing it as much. I'm not going to go out and say we don't see it anymore, but certainly don't see it as much. So, I mean, I touch on some of those past experiences, but some of the things that I see today, still today, that from an advice standpoint that I give women technology owners is one of them is I still feel that to some degree women are not as in control of the numbers as they should be, meaning not only their own financials and understanding the ins and outs of that. And I know a lot of women owners that just aren't comfortable with that. They have somebody else in their organization sort of handle it, which is fine. And that's great once you get larger. But I think you really have to have a good grip on it and understand your costs and how to adjust things in that regard, but also just your whole financial picture, right? Just understanding your portfolio and driving your portfolio to an end game. Early in the book, I talk about your magic number. What kind of like what's that number that you need to call it quits? And men and women alike, I'm always surprised with like, okay, so if we're going to sell your company, what do we need to get for it? Like, what's your magic number? Like, what do you have to have in the bank to call it a day? And they're like, yeah, I really don't know yet. And so you kind of have to get a handle on that. So I think just in general, I think women still shy away from just managing and running and just owning those numbers within their own organization. And then I think the other thing that we're still pushed to being is being super mom, right? So, I mean, thankfully I only had one child because I don't think I could
Hmm.
have had more than one. But even with one child, obviously wanted to be there for all the important things. But as I grew, and there was a period of time in my life where I actually ran three companies at once. I don't recommend that for anybody, but I was a crazy woman, like at three separate offices, you know, all different locations, two of them in two completely different cities. And, I couldn't be there to make dinner every night. And I had to give that up. I had to give up taking my kid from one practice to another or being there for that stuff that happened during the weekend, sometimes for the stuff on the weekend because I was traveling to a conference. I was traveling to Orlando and I had to leave on Saturday because the conference started on Sunday. And so I was going to miss a football game or practice or some church event on Sunday. I mean, it just was how it was. And you can't put all the burden on your spouse either or your partner because they get burned out, right? Like they've got their role and they're taking on your role. And so I really talk about getting that help at home. I mean, we have great help at work. We qualify the people that we work with in our office. If we really need to work more than 40 hours and we know we're going to travel, we need to have a team of people that we can rely on at home. And whether that's nannies or drivers, and then backups to those nannies and drivers, and backups to those people that are only available for you Monday through Friday because now you're traveling on the weekend and maybe your spouse is traveling on the weekend too. So both of you are gone, but the kids still need you know, stuff done for them and the grandparents aren't available. It's a lot of stress, right? To have that on you and to feel and think you can do it all yourself. It's just, I think that's just impossible. Like, yeah, we really want to have quality of life and be there for those important things. And I'm not saying you shouldn't be. It's it's important to be there for the big things and the true quality family time. So just like forget about the small stuff. Forget about going out and being the person that has to do the grocery run or pick up the stuff in the dry cleaners or even make dinner at night. If you can get a service that comes in or somebody that's capable that come in and do that for you, that's just great. And, yeah, can you afford it all? And when you first start, maybe not. But I think if you think about building that into your budget and what you take home every day because you need to afford to be able to do that, and you think about that as your take home salary as well, that you need to, like I said, build that into a budget, I think you really help yourself in the long run.
Interesting. Yeah, it's not a view that I personally or an approach, I guess I should say, that I hear all the time. But it makes a lot of sense if you're as driven and focused on this goal as you need to be, because it's really not something that, it being building a business that is sellable. Or can be acquired for millions, as the title of the book, uh, talks about. It's not an easy process in any aspect of it.
No, and we have a massive guilt trip, Jason,
Mm.
as both, as fathers and mothers. And I just don't say that's just a female thing, right? But, we have a massive guilt trip to leave our kids alone at home and doing things and being out, right? And that's why a lot of women leave the
Hmm.
workforce because they don't feel that, they don't feel it's right. They feel too guilty about doing this. And a lot of times it's that and not opportunities why they leave their role in their position or they slow down or whatever the case may be. And not that I didn't feel guilty from time to time, but because I had such people that I could count on, I didn't feel as guilty, and I felt like I could do my thing and make my deals and go to the conferences and be gone and take my sabbaticals. I talk a little bit about the in the book about this concept of a sabbatical where you take 4 to 6 weeks off to do two things. One, prove that you can be away from your organization that long and it can run without you. And that's great for buyers to see, but also for you just to be able to get away and to think without the daily tasks hounding you constantly. And I think that's great for envisioning where you're going to go and recasting yourself and seeing what your next big steps are going to be, because you just really need that time for your brain to decompress from work and be able to give it some space to think about and envision your future. I think it's so important for your growth as an organization and as a leader.
All right, excellent. Well, the book's title is Get Acquired for Millions, a roadmap for technology service providers to maximize company value. This has been a lot of fun, Linda. We'll be, as I said, posting not only the podcast, but some details on the um, value maximizer tool that you've referred to here, and information about the book itself, obviously. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. And if any of our listeners are going to be at Inspire, look forward to seeing you there as well. I'm going to have a book launch party, signing party, and we're giving away free copies of the book on Tuesday, the 16th. So you're welcome to come to my website, and I'll give you that link as well, Jason. If not, we're going to put the book on pre-sale on Amazon that day, and then shipping August 15th. And I guess we should also say, Jason, too, that the proceeds of the book, the net proceeds of the book for the first few months, are actually going to be dedicated towards a Women in Cloud, Women in Technology scholarship or something to further women in tech. I'm just, that's really a big thing for me. And so I'm just going to be dedicating all the net proceeds towards this initial launch, towards something valuable like inspiring and making sure that more women get into this technology space, because it's a great and rewarding career.
Yeah, and it really is. Fascinating reading your perspective, that mix of perspective as well as practical information in the book. I really do recommend it, and it's really a unique approach that I haven't seen in other books recently. So, yeah, thanks for sharing it. Thanks for talking about it here today, and best of luck with it.
All right, thanks, Jason. So good to connect again.
This has been another episode of the MSGW podcast. My thanks once again to Linda Rose for joining me today. If you have any comments, please be in touch by email, jgumpert@msdynamicsworld.com. Until next time, this is MS Dynamics World, signing off.